The rain didn't just fall that night. It seemed to be trying to wash the city away, sheet after relentless sheet of gray water hammering against the windows of the penthouse. Inside, the silence was heavier than the storm. Isabella Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, her hand resting instinctively on the hard curve of her belly. At 8 months pregnant, her body felt foreign to her, a vessel of life that ached with every step, swollen by the pressure of bringing a new human into the world. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest. Behind her, the apartment was a museum of perfection. Italian leather sofas, marble countertops that gleamed under recessed lighting, and abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a decade. It was a home that looked like a magazine spread, but felt like a tomb. She had spent the entire day cleaning, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, trying to tire herself out enough to sleep. She checked the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. 11:15 p.m. The dinner she had prepared, Julian's favorite herb-crusted rack of lamb with roasted root vegetables, sat on the dining table, the congealed fat turning the food into a sculpture of disappointment. For weeks, Julian had been coming home later and later. His excuses were always the same: mergers, acquisitions, the endless demands of the Vance empire. But lately, his voice had changed. When he spoke to her, the warmth had evaporated, replaced by a clipped, distant tone that sounded like he was reading a script. Love, Isabella knew, didn't sound like that. Love didn't sound tired when it said your name. She couldn't take the waiting anymore. The not knowing was eating her alive. She packed the cold food into a container, grabbed her coat, and headed for the door. She didn't care about the rain. She didn't care about the cab fare. She only cared about seeing him, about looking into his eyes and seeing if the man she married was still in there. The Vance Financial Tower was a monolith of steel and glass in the downtown district. When Isabella arrived, the lobby was bathed in the eerie blue glow of night lights. The security guard, a man named Sam who had seen her a dozen times, offered a sympathetic nod but didn't stop her. She took the elevator up, the numbers ascending like a countdown. When the doors slid open on the 40th floor, the air was different, stale with the scent of coffee and overtime stress. Julian's office was at the end of the hall, the blinds drawn. But the interior light was on. Through the frosted glass, she could see shadows moving. She stepped closer, her breath hitching. She could see them clearly now. Julian was sitting on the edge of his desk, leaning forward, his posture relaxed in a way it hadn't been around her in months. Opposite him sat a woman, a striking redhead with sharp cheekbones and a laugh that seemed to slice through the glass. Isabella recognized her. Sloane, the new junior executive Julian had hired 6 months ago. Isabella watched, paralyzed, as Sloane reached out and touched Julian's knee. He didn't pull away. Instead, he covered her hand with his, smiling a genuine, unburdened smile that Isabella realized he hadn't given her since their honeymoon. The shock hit her like a physical blow. The air left her lungs. Her baby kicked violently, as if he too felt the sudden drop in pressure. She pressed a hand against her abdomen, trying to steady herself, trying not to double over right there in the hallway. Julian looked up then, and his eyes locked with hers through the glass. He didn't jump. He didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed. He stood up, said something to Sloane, and walked over to the door, opening it just a crack. "Bella," he said, his voice low and irritated. "What are you doing here?" The words caught in her throat. She held up the container of food like an idiot. You didn't come home. I brought dinner." Behind him, Sloane was gathering her bag, pretending to look busy. Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. "This is embarrassing, Bella. You can't just ambush me at work. I told you I'm finalizing the Prague deal." "Finalizing the deal?" Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "With her hand on your leg?" Julian stepped into the hallway, closing the door behind him to shield Sloane. He lowered his voice, his eyes flashing with a cold anger she had never seen before. "You're being hysterical. Again. Ever since you got pregnant, you've been impossible. Paranoid. Clingy. I need you to calm down." "I'm not crazy, Julian. I'm your wife." "You are," he said, the words landing like a verdict. And you're acting like a child. Go home, Bella. We'll talk when I'm done here. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on her and went back into the office, closing the door firmly in her face. Isabella stood there for a long moment, the container of food growing heavy in her hand. Then, she turned and walked away. The elevator ride down felt like a descent into hell. By the time she stepped back out onto the street, the rain had turned into a deluge. She walked home. She didn't have the heart to call a cab. The water soaked her coat, her hair, her shoes, but the numbness inside her was colder than the rain. When she finally unlocked the penthouse door, the apartment was dark and empty. Julian wasn't there. She sat at the dining table, staring at the single plate setting she had laid out hours earlier, and waited. She waited until the sun came up, until the gray light of dawn revealed the dust motes dancing in the silence. But Julian didn't come home. At 8 a.m., the doorbell rang. Isabella stood up, her heart leaping. She rushed to the door, flinging it open. But it wasn't Julian. It was Constance Vance. Julian's mother stood in the hallway, flanked by 2 movers and a personal assistant. Constance was a woman who wore her wealth like armor, pearls at her throat, a designer suit that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle, and an expression of icy disdain that could freeze water. "Good morning, Isabella," Constance said, her voice smooth and cutting. "Please step aside." Isabella blinked, confused. "Mrs. Vance? What's going on? Where is Julian?" Constance breezed past her into the apartment, signaling the movers to start packing. "Julian is currently unavailable. And frankly, this little scene you caused last night was the final straw." "Scene? I found him with his mistress." Constance turned to her, her lips curling into a sneer. "Keep your voice down. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Julian has explained everything. Your emotional instability has become a liability to the firm. He needs peace, Isabella. He needs a partner who supports him, not one who interrogates him like a criminal." "I am carrying his grandchild," Isabella screamed, her voice cracking. Constance's eyes dropped to Isabella's belly, and for a second, something flickered there, disgust, perhaps. Or pity. Yes, an unfortunate complication. But Julian has made his decision. He's done trying to make this work. You, my dear, were always a temporary experiment. A bit of rough he thought he could polish. But we can see now that class isn't something you can buy. The words slapped Isabella across the face. "I love him." "Love." Constance laughed, a dry, brittle sound. "Love is for storybooks. In our world, we deal in assets and liabilities. And right now, you are a massive liability. You have 2 hours to pack your things. The movers will take what is yours. Everything else in this apartment belongs to the family. You can't do this," Isabella wept. "I have nowhere to go." "That is not our problem," Constance said, turning her back. "If you leave quietly, Julian will agree to a modest severance. If you fight him, he will bury you in lawyers' fees until you're living on the street. Choose wisely." Isabella watched, helpless, as the movers began to box up her life. Her books, her clothes, her photos. They were treated like trash, shoved into cardboard bins while Constance supervised with a clipboard. When they were finished, Isabella was handed a single suitcase and a check she couldn't even bring herself to look at. "The car is waiting," Constance said, holding the door open. "Don't come back, Isabella. For your own sake." Isabella was ushered into the elevator. As the doors closed, she saw Constance turn back into the apartment, already barking orders about repainting the walls. Isabella was dropped off at a subway station on the wrong side of town. The rain had started again, a relentless drizzle that soaked through her thin coat. She walked for hours, her phone dead, her body screaming in exhaustion. She tried to go to her childhood home, but when she arrived, a stranger answered the door. Her parents had sold the house and moved to Florida 3 years ago. She hadn't even realized she had no one left to call. Night fell, and the city turned into a maze of shadows. Isabella found herself at a bus stop on the edge of an industrial park. The shelter was small, offering little protection from the wind. She sat on the damp bench, clutching her suitcase, her teeth chattering. "It's okay," she whispered to her belly, tears streaming down her face. "I'll figure it out. I promise. I won't let us starve." But deep down, the terror was absolute. She was 30 years old, pregnant, homeless, and utterly alone. The man she loved had erased her as if she had never existed. Around midnight, a car drove past slowly, then slowed down. 2 women were walking by, chatting loudly under umbrellas. "Did you see the society page? Julian Vance is officially engaged to that Sloane woman. They say the wedding is next month in the Hamptons." "Engaged? I thought he was still married to that waitress, whatever her name was." "Isabella." Apparently, she had a breakdown. Julian filed for divorce citing irreconcilable differences and mental instability. Poor thing. She probably realized she never had a chance. The laughter faded into the distance, but the words lingered in the cold air. Isabella doubled over, a sob tearing from her throat. It was true. He was moving on. He was going to marry her. And Isabella was nothing more than a bad memory, a rumor to be whispered over cocktails. Lightning cracked the sky, followed instantly by a boom of thunder that shook the ground. The wind picked up, howling through the bus stop shelter. Isabella squeezed her eyes shut, praying for a miracle. For anything. For the pain to stop. Then she saw it. A flash of movement in the bushes nearby. Then a heavy thud as something landed near the bench. Isabella jumped, her heart hammering. Another flash of lightning illuminated the object. It was a black duffel bag. Heavy canvas, zipped tight. She stared at it, confused. She looked around. The street was empty. No one was there. With trembling hands, she reached out and pulled the bag closer. It was incredibly heavy. She unzipped the main compartment. She froze. Inside, bound in thick rubber bands, were stacks of cash. $100 bills. Hundreds of them. Isabella's breath hitched. She pulled one stack out. It was real. The smell of ink, the texture of the paper. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. Millions. She zipped the bag shut, her mind racing. Where did it come from? Who left it? Was it a trap? A part of her screamed to leave it. To call the police. But then she remembered Constance's cold smile. She remembered Julian's dismissal. She remembered the check in her pocket that wouldn't cover a month's rent in a cheap motel. She looked down at her belly, feeling the subtle movement of her son. "Okay," she whispered, her voice stealing. "If this is a sin, then let it be on my head." She grabbed the handle of the bag. It was heavy, awkward, but she lifted it. She didn't know where she was going, but she had the means to survive now. Isabella walked until she found a budget motel with a flickering neon sign. She paid for a week in cash, using a shaking hand to peel off the bills. The room was small, smelling of mildew and cheap air freshener, but the lock worked. She sat on the edge of the bed, the duffel bag at her feet, and finally let herself weep. She wept for the death of her marriage, for the betrayal of her husband, and for the terrifying, uncertain future that stared back at her. But when the tears stopped, she didn't feel weak. She felt something else. A resolve. A hardness she had never needed before. Julian had taken everything from her. Her home, her dignity, her love. But he hadn't taken her life. She opened the bag again. She counted the money. There was nearly $5 million in that bag. She took $100. Just enough to buy some food, some prenatal vitamins, and a burner phone. She buried the rest of the bag deep inside the mattress. She wasn't Isabella Vance anymore. That woman was dead, left behind in that penthouse. She looked in the cracked mirror above the sink. Her eyes were red, her face pale, but she recognized the woman staring back. "Hello, Elena," she whispered to her reflection. "Let's start over." 3 months passed. The city was different on this side of the river. Grittier, louder, but somehow more honest. Elena, as she now called herself, had found a rhythm. She had rented a small, basement apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It was damp and the heater rattled, but it was hers. She had found a job at a diner called the Blue Plate. It wasn't glamorous. She spent 10 hours a day on her feet, her hands raw from dish soap and grease, scrubbing plates and wiping down counters. But the owner, a woman named Maggie who had kind eyes and arms covered in tattoos, paid her under the table and didn't ask questions about her past. Elena kept to herself. She wore oversized sweaters to hide her pregnancy, and when the customers asked questions, she just smiled and said her husband was working overseas. Every night, she came home to the sound of the radiator hissing. She would eat a simple dinner of soup and toast, write in a cheap notebook she'd bought at a thrift store, and talk to her baby. "We're going to be okay, Leo," she would whisper, rubbing her belly. "Just you and me. We don't need them." But despite the new life, the shadows of the past still lingered. She watched the news religiously, terrified of seeing Julian's face. She knew the money in her mattress was dangerous. She knew it had to belong to someone: drug dealers, corrupt politicians, maybe even Julian's business rivals. But she touched it every night just to make sure it was real. Just to make sure she wasn't dreaming. One rainy Tuesday, Elena's world tilted on its axis again. It was late, past closing time. Elena was finishing up the last of the mopping when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up, expecting Maggie or a late straggler. Instead, a woman stood in the doorway. She was soaked to the bone, her expensive coat ruined, her usually perfectly coiffed hair plastered to her skull. It was Constance Vance. Elena froze, the mop handle clattering to the floor. Constance looked like she had aged a decade in 3 months. Her skin was sallow, her eyes rimmed with red. She looked around the diner, confusion warring with desperation, until her eyes landed on Elena. Or rather, on her belly. "Isabella?" Constance whispered, her voice breaking. "My name is Elena," Elena said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. Constance stumbled forward, gripping the edge of a booth for support. I didn't know where else to go. Lawyers, the banks, they've all frozen. What are you doing here?" Elena asked, her tone hard. "Did Julian send you to laugh at me?" "Julian is gone," Constance sobbed, collapsing into the booth. "He's gone, Isabella. They arrested him this morning." Elena stared at her. "Arrested? Fraud. Embezzlement. Money laundering," Constance choked out. "The FBI raided the tower this morning. They say he siphoned millions from the company accounts over the last 2 years. They're saying he's looking at 20 years. Elena felt a cold chill wash over her. She remembered the bag. The money she found the night she was thrown out. The night Julian was with Sloane. He took the money, Elena realized aloud. He stole it. It wasn't him. Constance cried, though she didn't sound convinced. It was that woman. Sloane. She convinced him to move the money into offshore accounts. But then she disappeared. She took everything that wasn't nailed down and fled the country. Julian is left holding the bag. Elena looked at the woman who had thrown her out like garbage, who had called her trash, who had told her she wasn't good enough. Now, Constance was the one on her knees. "And why come to me?" Elena asked. "You said I was nothing." "Because you're carrying his grandson," Constance wept. "And because I think you're the only one who knows where the rest of it is." Elena went still. "What?" "The FBI says there's $5 million unaccounted for," Constance said, her eyes searching Elena's face. "Cash. Taken from the office safe the night before the raid. Julian thinks Sloane dropped it somewhere. Or maybe he thinks I have it?" Elena finished for her. Constance didn't answer. She just looked at Elena with pleading eyes. "If you know anything, Isabella, please. You have to help him. He's your husband." "No," Elena said, her voice like iron. "He's not." She walked over to the door and held it open. "You need to leave now. Please." Constance begged, reaching out to grab Elena's hand. "I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. You were the best thing that ever happened to him. I was blind. Please help us." Elena pulled her hand away. "The night you kicked me out, I walked for miles in the rain. I sat at a bus stop and prayed for someone to help me. And you know what happened? God didn't answer. The universe didn't care. So, I helped myself." Constance stared at her, a dawning realization in her eyes. "Get out," Elena said again. "Before I call the police and tell them you're harassing me." Constance stood up slowly. She looked at Elena one last time, a mix of shame and hatred in her gaze, and then she turned and walked out into the rain. Elena locked the door behind her and leaned against it, her legs shaking. She knew she wasn't safe anymore. If Julian thought she had the money, he would tear the city apart to find it. And now, the FBI was looking for it too. She went home that night and didn't sleep. She packed a small bag. She took the duffel bag from under the mattress. She couldn't stay here. But as she was zipping up her coat, the news on the small TV in the corner caught her attention. Breaking news in the Vance financial scandal. Authorities have issued an international arrest warrant for Sloane Kensington, wanted in connection with the embezzlement scheme. Meanwhile, Julian Vance remains in custody without bail. Elena watched the footage of Julian being led out of the building in handcuffs. He looked broken, defeated. For a moment, she felt a pang of pity. Then she remembered the way he had looked at her through his office door. Annoyed, inconvenienced. She turned off the TV. She looked at the money. Then she looked at her notebook, filled with her scribblings about fear and survival. She realized something. Running wasn't the answer. Running just made her a victim again. She sat down and opened the notebook to a fresh page. She started to write. To the woman who finds this money when I am gone, use it to build something better. She wasn't going to keep it. She wasn't going to let it corrupt her the way it had corrupted Julian. But she wasn't going to give it back to the Vance family, and she wasn't going to turn herself in and spend her life in a prison cell for a crime she didn't commit. She was going to use it to even the score. 6 months later, the winter had passed, giving way to a humid, vibrant summer. In a quieter part of the city, a building that had once been an abandoned textile factory was now buzzing with life. The sign above the door read, "The Harbor." It wasn't a shelter. It wasn't a charity. It was a sanctuary. A place for women who had fallen through the cracks of the world, women like Elena. Women who had been abused, discarded, or forgotten. It offered legal counsel, childcare, job training, and a safe place to sleep. Elena stood in the main hall, watching the women and children playing. The space was bright, painted in warm yellows and soft blues. There were bookshelves filled with donated books, a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread, and a nursery where babies napped in peace. Elena's son, Leo, was now 3 months old. He lay in a bassinet near her desk, sleeping soundly. He had Julian's nose, Elena's chin, and a spirit that was entirely his own. The money from the bag had been carefully laundered, not for profit, but for protection. Elena had found a way to funnel it into the nonprofit, paying for the building, the renovations, and the staff salaries in small, untraceable increments. It was the restitution the Vance family owed to the world. The front door opened, and the heavy silence of the hallway was broken by the sound of heels clicking on the concrete floor. Elena looked up. It was Constance Vance again. But this time, she wasn't wearing a designer suit. She looked frail, her hair white as snow, her clothes simple and worn. The room went quiet. The women stared, sensing the tension. Constance walked slowly to Elena's desk. She didn't look at the other women. She only looked at Elena. "Isabella," she said softly. "Elena," she corrected. Constance nodded. "Elena. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see where you went." "Julian was sentenced last week," Constance continued, her voice hollow. 12 years. He's appealing, but I don't think he'll ever come home to me." Elena said nothing. She just waited. "Your son," Constance said, her eyes drifting to the bassinet. "Julian. He doesn't even know his name." "Does he?" "No," Elena said. "And he never will." Constance let out a long, shuddering breath. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the desk. "This is for him," she said. "It's not much. The government took everything else. But it's a trust. Whatever I have left, it goes to Leo. I've had my lawyer draw it up. He can't touch it until he's 18. Elena looked at the envelope. It was a small thing, a piece of paper. But it was more than Julian had ever given her. "Why?" Elena asked. Constance looked around the room, at the women who were rebuilding their lives with Elena's help. Because I was wrong about you, Constance whispered. I thought strength came from money, from pedigree. I see now that true strength, true royalty, is what you have. The ability to build a palace out of ashes. Constance turned to leave. She paused at the door, looking back one last time. He's beautiful, Isabella, she said. Don't let him become his father. I won't, Elena promised. Constance walked out, disappearing into the street, leaving the envelope on the desk. Elena picked it up. It was light, but it felt heavy. That afternoon, the radio played in the background as Elena fed Leo. The news anchor's voice cut through the soft jazz. Police in Madrid have apprehended Sloane Kensington. She was found attempting to board a flight to Morocco with a forged passport. Authorities have recovered stolen jewelry and documents, though the bulk of the missing cash remains unaccounted for. Elena smiled. She looked down at her son, who was grasping her finger with his tiny hand. The money didn't matter anymore. The revenge didn't matter. They had their justice. She looked around the harbor. She saw a young mother who had escaped a domestic violence situation teaching her daughter to read. She saw an elderly woman who had been evicted knitting a scarf for a newborn. The money hadn't destroyed her. It had redeemed her. It had turned her pain into a bridge for others. Elena kissed Leo's forehead. You hear that, little man, she whispered. The storm is over. The sun is finally coming out. And for the first time in a long time, as the golden afternoon light streamed through the high windows of the old factory, Elena believed it. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a beginning,